The red light was already on. She noticed it a second too late. After she had sat down, after she had wiped her palms against her jeans, after the quiet of the room had pressed in so hard it felt like it was crawling under her skin. The camera stood on the small table across from her, steady and indifferent, its lens fixed on her face like an unblinking eye. For a moment, she considered standing up and turning it off. Instead, she inhaled sharply and stayed where she was. The room was plain, too plain, white walls, a single lamp casting a dull yellow circle, shadows stretching into corners that felt deeper than they should have been. There was no decoration, no warmth, just a chair, a table, and a camera. It looked less like a place meant for living, and more like a place meant for telling the truth, or being judged by it. She folded her hands together, then unfolded them. Her fingers trembled. She pressed them flat against her thighs, as if she could force them into stillness through sheer will. "I don't know how to start this," she said finally. Her voice sounded thinner than she expected, fragile, as if it might break apart mid-sentence and never come back together. She swallowed and glanced away from the lens, eyes fixed on the wall to her left. There was a faint crack running through the paint there. She focused on it, counting the seconds between her breaths. I guess I should say my name," she continued, then stopped, her lips pressed together tightly. After a beat, she shook her head. "No, that doesn't matter. Not yet." Silence stretched again. The camera kept recording. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees, her shoulders curling inward. The posture wasn't accidental. It was protective, defensive, the posture of someone who had already been accused, even if no one else was in the room. "I'm doing this because I was asked to," she said. The words came faster now, as if she was afraid of what would happen if she slowed down. "No, because I was told to. And because if I don't say out loud, it's going to keep eating at me until there's nothing left." Her eyes finally met the lens. There was fear there, not the loud, panic kind, but something quieter and more dangerous. The fear of consequences. The fear of what came after the truth. "I made a mistake," she said. "Not one mistake. A series of them." She paused again, chest rising and falling too quickly. Somewhere outside the frame, something creaked. Pipes, maybe, or the building settling. She flinched at the sound. "I hurt someone I love," she went on. "Someone who trusted me. And I keep telling myself I had reasons. That I was lonely. That I was confused. That I didn't mean for it to go this far." Her mouth twisted into something like a bitter smile. "But it did." She reached up, brushing hair back from her face with shaking fingers. There was a faint mark on her wrist. Easy to miss unless you were looking for it. She didn't mention it. "I'm not proud of what I did," she said softly. "I'm ashamed, and I'm scared. Because once this is said, once it's recorded, I can't take it back." She looked down, then back up again, eyes glossy now. "But I can't keep pretending anymore." The red light blinked steadily, and as she drew in a breath to finally say what she had done, the truth she had come here to confess, the weight of what was coming next already hung in the room, heavy and inescapable, pulling her forward toward a moment that could no longer be stopped. She took another breath, deeper this time, as if she were preparing to dive underwater. "I cheated." The word landed heavily in the room, louder than she intended. She winced, her eyes closing for a brief second, as though saying it out loud had caused physical pain. When she opened them again, they were fixed on the camera, steady now, but not calm. "I didn't plan it," she said quickly, the words tumbling over one another. "I know everyone says that, but it's true. It didn't start the way people imagine. There was no hotel room, no secret dates. It started with talking, late nights, messages that felt harmless because they weren't touching anything yet." Her fingers twisted together again, knuckles whitening. "I told myself it wasn't real," she went on, "that I wasn't doing anything wrong, that I deserved to feel understood." She laughed softly, without humor. "That's the lie, isn't it? The one everyone uses." For a moment, she looked away from the camera again, gaze drifting downward. When she spoke next, her voice softened, almost intimate. "You didn't see it coming," she said, addressing someone who wasn't there. You trusted me. You trusted us. And every time I looked at you, I thought, I'll stop today. I'll fix it before it becomes something unforgivable. Her jaw tightened. But I didn't stop. The confession deepened, moving from hesitation into something rawer, more exposed. She admitted to meetings disguised as errands, to deleting messages with shaking hands, to rehearsing lies before walking through the door. The narration of her choices wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, almost clinical, as if she had replayed these moments too many times already. It wasn't just physical, she said, shaking her head. That's what hurts the most. I gave someone else the parts of me that were supposed to be yours. My attention, my fear, my secrets. She hesitated, then added quietly, my obedience. The word lingered. Her eyes flicked briefly to the side, towards something off camera. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, an instinctive check, as if making sure she was still alone. I know this video wasn't supposed to exist, she said. I know it wasn't meant for anyone else to see. It was supposed to be contained, controlled. She swallowed hard. But I needed proof that I told the truth. That I didn't just think it, I said it. A tear slipped free, tracing a slow path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. I'm sorry, she whispered, and this time the apology felt less rehearsed. I'm sorry for lying. I'm sorry for manipulating you into believing I was still the person you fell in love with. Her breathing became uneven. She paused, collecting herself, then spoke again, more carefully now. There's something else, she said. Something I don't know how to explain without it sounding worse than it already is. She leaned closer to the camera, lowering her voice instinctively. I didn't feel like I could stop, she admitted. Every time I tried to pull away, it got harder, like I owed something, like there would be consequences if I didn't keep playing my part. Her fingers curled into her palms. I'm not saying this to excuse what I did, she said firmly. I'm saying it because it's the truth. And because if something happens, if this all goes wrong, then at least there will be a record that I tried to say it out loud. She sat back, shoulders sagging, as if the act of confessing had drained whatever strength she had left. That's it, she said. That's what I did. For a few seconds, she just stared at the camera, eyes red, expression unreadable. Then she reached forward, hand lifting toward the lens. Her fingers hovered over the button. Somewhere beyond the room, a faint sound echoed. Footsteps, maybe, or a door shifting in its frame. She froze. The camera kept recording. Her hand remained suspended in the air, fingers trembling inches from the camera. The sound came again, closer this time. She didn't turn around. She didn't speak. She simply listened, every muscle in her body tightening as the quiet she had relied on moments earlier suddenly felt fragile, temporary. Whatever it was, footsteps, a door, the building settling. It reminded her of something she had been trying not to think about since the moment she sat down. She slowly lowered her hand. The camera stayed on. Seconds passed, then a full minute. She remained in the chair, staring past the lens now, her eyes unfocused, as if she were replaying every word she had just said. Her breathing gradually steadied, but the fear didn't leave her face. If anything, it deepened, settling into something resigned. Okay, she murmured to herself. Not to the camera, not to anyone else. Just a word to keep from breaking. She stood up. The chair scraped softly against the floor as she pushed it back. For a moment, she hesitated, glancing toward the camera as if considering whether to turn it off after all. Instead, she reached for her phone from the table beside her, checking the screen quickly. No new messages. No missed calls. She exhaled, sharp and shallow. I'll be right back, she said quietly, instinctively, as if someone were listening. She stepped out of frame. The room was left empty. Just a hum of electricity, the faint buzz of the lamp, the unblinking eye of the camera continuing to record a space where something irreversible had just been said. Time moved strangely without her presence. Each second stretched longer than the last. 10 minutes. 15. Nothing happened. The silence grew oppressive, thick enough to feel intentional. Somewhere beyond the walls, a distant sound echoed, muffled voices, perhaps or a door closing far away. The camera caught none of it clearly. Only shadows shifted slightly as the light flickered. Then, at around the 20-minute mark, something changed. A sudden noise, closer, sharper. The unmistakable sound of movement in the room just beyond the frame. A breath, audible but strained. A hand brushed briefly into view, fingers grazing the edge of the table, knocking it just enough to make the camera wobble. There was no scream, no struggle captured on video, only a sharp intake of breath, and then nothing. The recording continued for several more minutes, showing the same empty room, the same chair, the same lamp casting its dull circle of light. Eventually, the battery warning flashed briefly in the corner of the screen before the footage cut to black. By the time anyone else entered the room, the silence had already done its damage. She was found lying on the floor, just out of the camera's view. The official report would later say she was unresponsive when discovered. That help was called immediately, that there were no obvious signs of forced entry. But there was one detail no report could ignore. The camera was still there, still pointed at the chair, still recording a confession that had ended 20 minutes before she died. And the first person to see it, to really see it, would be the man she had been speaking to all along. He arrived later than he was supposed to. That fact would matter later, though no one pressed him on it first. Grief has a way of softening questions, of turning suspicion into sympathy. When he pushed the door open and stepped inside, the room looked ordinary, almost calm. Too calm for what waited just beyond the camera's frame. He called her name once, then again, louder. When she didn't answer, he moved farther into the room, his footsteps slow, uncertain, as if part of him already knew what he was about to see and was trying to delay it. The lamp was still on. The chair was slightly out of place. And the camera, small, black, unmistakable, sat on the table, its red light no longer blinking. His gaze passed over it without stopping. It was her on the floor that pulled the sound from his throat. Not a scream. Something quieter. Broken. He dropped to his knees beside her, touching her shoulder, then her face, as if the right amount of pressure might wake her, reset the moment, undo the last 20 minutes. Her skin was cold. "No," he whispered. No, this isn't." He didn't finish the sentence. He staggered backward, scrambling for his phone, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The call to emergency services was brief and chaotic, his words tumbling over each other. He said her name too many times. He said he had just arrived. He said he didn't know what happened. By the time help arrived, there was nothing to be done. The paramedics exchanged a look he didn't notice. The kind professionals learn to share when hope is already gone. They checked anyway. Pulse, breathing, pupils. But the outcome was inevitable. One of them gently asked him to step outside. He didn't resist. He stood in the hallway with his back against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, his head buried in his hands. He cried then, openly, violently, the kind of grief that makes people look away out of respect. When the police arrived shortly after, the scene was already thick with the weight of finality. He answered their initial questions through tears. Yes, they had argued recently. Yes, she'd been distant. No, he didn't know why she'd been alone. No, he hadn't seen the camera before. He said it casually, almost dismissively, as if it were nothing more than clutter. "I didn't even notice it," he said. "I was just focused on her." One of the officers made a note. Inside the room, another officer stood quietly, taking it all in. The chair, the lamp, the camera. It was still positioned directly toward where she had been sitting. When the officer reached for it, someone else spoke up. "Wait." They checked the device carefully. The battery was nearly dead, but the footage was still there. The officer's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticed. A tightening around the eyes. A pause too long to be nothing. Outside, the man wiped his face with his sleeve as a detective approached him. "We're very sorry for your loss," the detective said gently. "I just have a few more questions." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Anything. Can you tell me," the detective asked, "when the last time you spoke to her was?" He hesitated, just for a second. "Earlier today." he said. She said she needed time, that she had something important to do. The detective nodded slowly. Did she say what it was? No. Another pause. Inside the room, the officer pressed play. The screen flickered to life. The red light came on, and the woman's face appeared, sitting in the chair, staring into the camera, about to confess to something that would change everything the man outside thought he knew about her and about himself. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the device as the footage played. The detective stood behind the officer, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screen. Outside, the man who had found her sat hunched in a plastic chair, unaware that the story he believed he knew was already unraveling. On the screen, she leaned forward, nervous, apologetic. Everything the detective expected from a confession like this. The words came slowly at first, then faster, spilling out as if she were afraid the camera might stop her mid-sentence. The betrayal was clear, painful, human. Then came the pause. Every time I tried to pull away, she said on the recording, her voice lowering, it got harder. The detective leaned in slightly. She hesitated there, eyes shifting. Not to the lens this time, but just past it. Her lips parted, as if she were about to say something else. Something she hadn't planned to. I didn't mean for it to happen with, she began. She stopped. The silence stretched. Her throat moved as she swallowed. With, she tried again. The name never fully formed, but it was there, half-spoken, barely audible, a sound more than a word, the kind of thing most people would miss if they weren't listening for it. The officer paused the video. Did you hear that? He asked. The detective nodded slowly. Play it again. They replayed the moment, this time with the volume turned up. The syllable was clearer now, still incomplete, but unmistakably intentional. She hadn't just stopped mid-thought. She had stopped herself. She almost said a name, the officer said, and decided not to, the detective replied. That choice mattered. They let the video continue. She spoke of guilt, of fear, of consequences. But her body language had changed after that moment. Her shoulders tensed. Her words became more careful, controlled, as if she were navigating around something dangerous. She's not just confessing, the detective murmured. She's managing information. The footage ended shortly after. The screen went dark. For a long moment, no one spoke. Could be nothing, the officer offered. Could just be nerves. Or, the detective said quietly, it could be someone she was more afraid of than the man she was apologizing to. Outside, the man looked up as the detective approached him again. His eyes were red, his face drained of color. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, even though the worst night of his life had barely begun. We found something on the camera, the detective said. A video your partner recorded earlier today. The man stiffened. A video? Yes, the detective replied. A confession. The word landed heavily between them. He stared, confusion flashing across his face before giving way to something sharper. Something wounded. Confession to what? The detective watched him carefully. To cheating. The man flinched as if struck. His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked down at the floor, shaking his head slowly. No, he said. She couldn't. There's more, the detective added. The man looked up. In the video, the detective said, she almost mentioned someone else, another person involved. The silence that followed was different now. Taut, alert, the man's hands curled into fists. Who? That, the detective said evenly, is what we're trying to figure out. Inside the building, another officer was already working through her phone records, her deleted messages, her contacts. Names surfaced, numbers without labels, gaps where conversations should have been. Somewhere in those gaps was a name she had stopped herself from saying, and whoever it belonged to wasn't just part of an affair. They were about to become part of a murder investigation. The name didn't appear at first. Investigators expected it to, some obvious contact, some thread that would pull loose the moment they touched it. Instead, what they found was absence. Conversations that ended too cleanly. Message chains that stopped mid-sentence. long gaps in call logs that didn't match her usual patterns. It was as if someone had known exactly what to remove. The detective stared at the screen displaying her phone data, jaw tight. "This isn't careless," he said quietly. "This is deliberate." They began working backward, not just through her digital life, but through her emotional one. Friends were brought in for interviews, one by one, each offering fragments of the same unsettling picture. "She changed," one friend said, twisting a tissue in her hands. "Not all at once. Slowly. She stopped laughing the way she used to." Another mentioned how she'd grown jumpy, checking her phone constantly, silencing notifications, stepping outside to take calls she wouldn't explain. Someone else remembered bruises she laughed off. "Stress," she'd said. "Clumsiness." She was scared, a co-worker admitted, but not of her partner, of disappointing someone. That word lingered. Disappointing. The detective circled it on his notepad. It wasn't the language of a simple affair. It wasn't the recklessness of desire or the selfishness of betrayal. It was the language of obligation, of debt, of power. When they finally uncovered the hidden account, an encrypted messaging app buried beneath innocuous folders, it didn't reveal passion so much as control. The messages weren't explicit. They were precise. Instructions disguised as concern. Guilt framed as loyalty. "You said you wouldn't disappear again. I thought we agreed you'd tell me everything. Don't make me regret trusting you." There were timestamps attached to moments the woman had described in her confession, moments when she tried to pull away. Every attempt was followed by escalation. The detective leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This isn't a love story," he said. "It's leverage." They finally attached a name to it. Someone who didn't exist publicly in her life. Someone with influence over her career, her reputation, her future. Someone who could afford to stay hidden while she carried the weight of secrecy alone. The secret lover wasn't reckless. They were careful, calculated, and they had something to lose. Meanwhile, the man who had found her sat alone in an interview room, replaying the word cheated over and over in his head like a wound that wouldn't close. When the detective returned, the man looked up with hollow eyes. "You said there was someone else," he said. "Who was it?" "We're still confirming details," the detective replied. "But I want to ask you something first." The man nodded. "Did she ever seem afraid?" the detective asked. "Not guilty. Afraid." The question caught him off guard. He frowned, thinking. "She was anxious," he said slowly. "Lately, she said she felt trapped. I thought she meant by me. By us." The detective watched his face carefully. "Did she ever say she felt controlled?" The man swallowed. "No. She said she felt like she owed someone. I didn't understand what she meant." Neither had she at first. As investigators pieced together the timeline, a pattern emerged. The confession hadn't been spontaneous. It had been prompted, pressured. The woman hadn't just decided to tell the truth. She had been pushed toward it, boxed into a corner where exposure felt inevitable. The camera hadn't been her idea. That realization shifted everything. The detective returned to the footage, watching it again with new eyes. Her careful phrasing, her pauses, the way she avoided saying the name, the way she glanced off camera, as if checking for permission. She hadn't been confessing freely. She had been performing. And when she stepped out of frame after the recording ended, it wasn't relief on her face. It was dread. The detective closed the file slowly. "She didn't die because she cheated," he said. "She died because she was trying to stop being controlled." Outside, the man sat alone, staring at the floor, unaware that the truth was shifting beneath his feet, that betrayal was no longer the center of the story. Power was, and whoever had wielded it was about to realize that silence, once broken, had consequences they could no longer manage. Once the idea of control entered the investigation, nothing looked the same. The case widened, not outward, but inward, peeling back layers of motive that had been hiding beneath ordinary behavior. What had once seemed like a single act of betrayal now revealed itself as a web of pressure points, each one capable of snapping under the right circumstances. The detective laid the photos out on the table. The woman smiling at a dinner months earlier. The man who loved her standing beside her, unaware. A blurred security still from a parking garage. A screenshot of a message that had been deleted but not erased deeply enough. Everyone had a reason, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. The man who found her had motive written all over him, at least on paper. Betrayal, humiliation, rage. Detectives had seen it before. People who claimed shock, who cried convincingly, who insisted they'd never hurt the person they loved. Sometimes they were telling the truth. Sometimes they weren't. His timeline didn't help him. He said he arrived later than planned. He couldn't explain exactly why. Traffic, a missed call, a moment where he'd needed space. Each answer was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed gaps. "You were upset," the detective said during a follow-up interview. "Yes," the man replied, "but not like that. I was hurt, confused." "Enough to confront her?" The man looked down. "Yes." "Enough to lose control?" "No," he said quickly. Too quickly. Then more quietly, "I loved her." Love didn't eliminate motive. It complicated it. Then there was a secret lover, the one whose presence was felt more than seen. No public arguments. No jealous messages left behind. Just influence, pressure, fear, the kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice. The detective reviewed the messages again. The tone never changed, even as her replies grew shorter, more desperate. "I'm trying. Please don't do this now. I just need time." Time she never got. And then there was a possibility no one wanted to say out loud, that she herself had been breaking. The confession video showed cracks. Fatigue etched into her face, the way her thoughts looped, the quiet resignation in her voice. The pressure from both sides, one demanding honesty, the other demanding silence, had boxed her in. A psychological autopsy suggested prolonged emotional stress, hypervigilance, fear responses, isolation. None of it proved what happened in those 20 minutes, but it painted a picture of someone standing at the edge of something dangerous. She was running out of exits, the forensic psychologist said. That's when people make choices that don't always look rational from the outside. The detective didn't like that explanation, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. He returned again to the 20-minute window. He replayed it in his head the way the camera had replayed it on screen. The empty chair, the faint sounds, the sudden disruption. Something had changed in that room. Someone had been there, or something had happened that altered the course she'd been on. They tested the room again. Sightlines, sound travel, how long it would take to move from the hallway to the camera's blind spot, how close someone would need to be to cause the wobble in the frame. It all pointed to proximity. Opportunity wasn't limited to one person. The man had access. The secret lover had leverage, and possibly timing. Even the building itself offered opportunities. Shared spaces, thin walls, moments when privacy was an illusion. The detective felt the familiar frustration settle in. Too many reasons, too many possibilities, each one plausible, each one dangerous. He returned to the footage late that night, alone this time. He watched it without sound first, focusing only on her face, the micro-expressions, the moments where her eyes flicked away, the instant her posture changed. Halfway through the confession, something struck him. She wasn't just afraid. She was careful. Careful about how she framed things. Careful about what she emphasized and what she softened, almost as if she were shaping a narrative, not simply telling the truth. He rewound the video and turned the sound back on. This time, he listened not for what she said, but for what didn't belong, for the subtle inconsistencies, for the words that felt planted, for the lie hiding inside the truth. And as the footage played again, the detective realized something unsettling. If everyone had a reason, then the answer wouldn't come from motive alone. It would come from the moment the story stopped being hers. The detective watched the video again, this time with the sound barely above a whisper. He had learned long ago that truth often hid in discomfort, in the places where people hesitated, where their words slowed or rushed unnaturally. Lies weren't always loud. Sometimes they were carefully placed, designed to feel reasonable. He paused the footage at a moment, halfway through her confession. She was speaking about guilt, about responsibility, about betrayal. Her tone was steady, rehearsed, too steady. The detective leaned closer to the screen, studying her face. "Play from 10 seconds earlier," he said. The officer rewound the clip. This time, they watched together. She shifted in her chair before answering an imagined question. Her shoulders straightened, her jaw set. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The posture of someone bracing themselves before saying something difficult. "I hurt someone I love," she said. The detective frowned. That line again. They'd heard it before. Everyone had. It sounded honest, self-aware. But something about it bothered him now. "She never says how she hurt him," he said. "Not really." The officer nodded. She avoided specifics. They moved through confession line by line, comparing her words to what they knew from her messages, her behavior, her interviews. Where her story was vague, her digital life had been precise. Where she claimed choice, the messages showed pressure. Where she framed events as mutual, the tone of the secret conversation suggested imbalance. "She's taking more blame than she needs to," the officer said slowly. "Or," the detective replied, "she's redirecting it." The idea settled heavily between them. He replayed the moment where she almost said the other name. Her voice wavered. Her eyes darted off camera. That wasn't guilt. That was calculation, an instinct to protect someone or to avoid provoking them. "She's afraid of the wrong person," the detective said. They turned their attention to the timing. The confession ended. She stood. She left the frame. 20 minutes passed. "What if," the officer said carefully, "the video isn't just a confession?" The detective didn't look away from the screen. "Go on." "What if it's a message?" the officer continued. "Not to the man she cheated on, but to someone else. A warning, a record, insurance." The detective leaned back, considering it. The camera hadn't been hidden. It had been placed deliberately at eye level with good lighting. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It had been prepared. "She knew something was coming," he said, "and she wanted proof of how it started. That's when they found it. The discrepancy that shouldn't have been there. The timestamp. According to her phone, she had sent a text just minutes before starting the recording. The content had been deleted, but the recipient hadn't. It wasn't the man who found her. It was the secret lover. And the message time didn't align with the narrative she presented on camera. In the video, she spoke as if she were confessing freely, acting on conscience alone. But the timestamp suggested urgency, pressure, a trigger. "She didn't decide to confess," the detective said quietly. "She was prompted." That was a lie inside the video. Not that she cheated, but that she was in control of confession. They brought in a forensic linguist the next morning, someone who studied patterns in speech, where language stopped being natural and started becoming shaped. The expert listened carefully, marking sections of the transcript. "These phrases," she said, pointing, "are consistent with coach admissions, broad statements, emotional framing without detail. It's how people confess when they're afraid of consequences." "Legal consequences?" the officer asked. The linguist shook her head. "Personal ones." The detective felt the case shift again, like a floorboard giving way beneath his feet. The video had been treated as evidence of guilt. Now it looked more like evidence of coercion, which meant the most important question had changed. Not who killed her, but who needed her to speak and then never speak again. He looked at the screen one last time, at her face frozen mid-frame. "You tried to tell us," he said softly. Outside the room, a call came in. A name had finally surfaced, attached to power access and a very specific 20-minute window. The detective straightened. It was time to confront the mask. The interview room was colder than it needed to be. The detective noticed it immediately. The way the man across the table adjusted his jacket, the way his breath fogged slightly as he exhaled. Power didn't like discomfort. It wasn't used to being contained in small, undecorated spaces with no audience and no leverage. He had arrived calm, polite, confident enough to seem cooperative. That was the mask. "We appreciate you coming in," the detective said evenly. We just want to clarify a few things. Of course, the man replied, folding his hands neatly on the table. I want to help however I can. What happened to her is tragic. He said her name perfectly, smoothly, as if he'd practiced it. The detective slid a folder forward but didn't open it. You knew her longer than most people realize. The man smiled faintly. I knew her professionally. Professionally, the detective repeated, with personal expectations. The smile thinned, just a fraction. They let silence do the work. It always did. She reached out to you the day she died, the detective said, minutes before she started recording. I don't recall the exact timing, the man replied. She was emotional, unstable, even. I tried to encourage her to be honest. Honest with whom? The detective asked. With herself, the man said smoothly. With the people she hurt. The detective opened a folder now, revealing printed transcripts, message fragments, timestamps, highlighted phrases. Don't make me regret protecting you. You know what happens if this comes out the wrong way. The man glanced down, then back up again, unbothered. Context matters, he said. It does, the detective agreed. That's why we reconstructed the 20 minutes after the recording ended. That got a reaction. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes, a subtle shift in posture. The man leaned back, reassessing. You were in the building, the detective continued. Not officially, of course, but the security camera across the street caught your car. You entered through a shared access point at 6:14 p.m. I stopped by to talk, the man said. She asked me to. The detective nodded. And when she tried to back out? The man's jaw clenched. She was spiraling. She was making reckless choices. Like telling the truth? The detective asked. Silence. The mask cracked there. Not fully, but enough. She didn't understand the consequences. The man said finally, people like her think confession is brave. They don't think about collateral damage. Or about who controls the narrative, the detective replied. The man's eyes hardened. I never touched her. No, the detective said quietly. You didn't have to. He laid out the final timeline. The moment she left the camera's frame. The confrontation just out of view. The pressure escalating. The words that couldn't be heard, but could be inferred. She thought the video would protect her. The detective said, that once it existed, you'd stop. The man laughed softly. That was naive. That was when the mask slipped completely. You don't get to ruin people and call it truth, he snapped. She owed me. I made her. I kept her safe. By controlling her, the detective said. By managing her, the man corrected. There's a difference. The room felt smaller now. He realized too late that he'd said too much. She didn't die because she cheated, the detective said. She died because she stopped complying. The man stared at him, breathing hard. You can't prove intent. Maybe not, the detective replied. But we can prove pressure. We can prove coercion. And we can prove you were the last person with her. Another pause. Longer this time. When the man finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. Colder. She was weak. The detective stood. No, she was done. The arrest didn't happen dramatically. No shouting. No resistance. Just a slow realization. Settling in. That power no longer worked here. As the man was led away, the detective remained behind, staring at the empty chair. Outside, the betrayed partner waited, unaware of the full truth but sensing its shape. He would learn soon, not everything, but enough. Justice, the detective knew, would be imperfect, but the mask was off now. And once that happened, there was no going back, only forward, into consequences that would finally force the truth to stand on its own. The courtroom was nothing like the confession room. There were no shadows clinging to corners, no silence thick with dread. Everything was bright, polished, controlled. Justice, when presented to public, preferred clean lines and neutral colors. It preferred order. The truth, however, did not. The man sat at the defense table in a tailored suit, hands folded neatly, expression carefully measured. The mask he had worn for years hadn't disappeared. It had simply evolved. Gone was the raw arrogance of the interrogation room. In its place stood restraint, professional regret, the performance of accountability, without the substance of it. The betrayed partner sat several rows back, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed forward. He had learned enough by now to know that the woman he loved had been caught between forces larger than either of them. Still, that knowledge didn't erase the ache. Betrayal had not vanished in the story. It had simply been reframed. And reframing didn't heal wounds. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. They spoke of coercion, of power imbalance, of psychological manipulation that tightened slowly, invisibly, until resistance felt impossible. They played clips from the confession video, not to shame her, but to show the fear beneath her words. She was not confessing freely, the prosecutor said. She was documenting pressure. The defense countered just as calmly. No physical evidence of violence. No direct recording of the confrontation. No explicit threat captured on tape. Tragic does not equal criminal, the defense attorney said. Influence is not murder. The detective watched from the gallery, jaw tight. He had seen this before. The way complexity gave doubt room to breathe. The way truth, when layered and uncomfortable, became harder to hold. Experts testified. A forensic linguist explained coach speech. A psychologist described the effects of prolonged emotional control. Each word added clarity, and yet somehow also distance. The woman at the center of it all was no longer a person in the room. She was evidence. When the video played again, her voice filled the courtroom, softer than anyone remembered. The jury watched her face flicker across the screen, nervous, apologetic, careful. They heard the moment where she almost said the other name. The pause. The choice to stop. That moment mattered. But it wasn't enough to tell the whole story. In the end, the verdict came down to what could be proven beyond doubt. Not what felt true, not what seemed obvious in hindsight. The man was found guilty of coercion and obstruction, of abuse of power, of actions that directly contributed to her psychological distress, but not of murder. The word echoed anyway, unspoken but heavy. A sentence was handed down. Years, not life. Consequences, but not absolution. Justice, delivered carefully, as the system required. The betrayed partner left the courtroom before it emptied. He couldn't bring himself to look at the man who had helped destroy what he thought he had. He also couldn't escape the knowledge that the woman he loved had made choices of her own, choices shaped by fear, but choices nonetheless. That truth was harder than anger. Outside, reporters waited. Headlines were already forming, simplified, sharpened, stripped of nuance. A powerful figure held accountable. A tragic woman remembered. A case closed. But the detective knew better. Cases like this never really closed. They only stopped being investigated. That night, he returned to his office and watched the confession video one last time. Not as evidence. Not as a puzzle. As a record. She had known the system might fail her. Had known justice would be partial. Compromised by what couldn't be captured on camera. And still, she had spoken. He paused the video at the very end, right before she stood up, right before the 20 minutes that changed everything. You weren't wrong, he said quietly to the empty room. But you paid too much of the truth. Justice had been served, they would say, but it wasn't clean, and it wasn't complete. All that remained now was her voice, and what those left behind chose to do with it. The video never stopped existing. Long after the courtroom emptied, long after the headlines faded and the sentence became a number buried in public record, the file remained, copied, archived, referenced, misunderstood. A woman in a chair, a red light, a truth spoken too late to save her. The detective watched it one final time, not as an investigator, but as a witness. He didn't pause it, didn't rewind. He let it play the way it had the first time, uninterrupted, imperfect, human. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not weak, just tired. A woman who had reached the end of her ability to carry what she'd been holding alone. Every hesitation now felt louder, every careful word heavier. The lie inside the video was clearer than ever. Not the lie of cheating, but the lie of agency. She had spoken because silence had become unbearable, and then she had been gone. The betrayed partner never watched the full recording. He couldn't. He had tried once, late at night, alone in the apartment they'd shared. He made it halfway through before the sound of her voice became too much, before guilt and love tangled into something he didn't have a name for. He knew now that betrayal wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something darker, something neither of them had understood in time. That knowledge didn't bring peace, but it softened the anger into something quieter, something sadder. He kept one thing of hers, the jacket she wore on cold evenings, still faintly smelling like her shampoo. It was proof she had been real, more than a headline, more than a case. The world moved on. Another story replaced hers. Another scandal. Another tragedy packaged for consumption. Her name surfaced occasionally in think pieces and documentaries, framed as a cautionary tale about power, about silence, about what happens when control disguises itself as care. But none of them captured the moment that mattered most. Not the confession, not the arrest, not even the verdict. The moment that mattered was the 20 minutes after she stood up from that chair, when she believed, however briefly, that speaking might be enough. It wasn't. Justice came, but it came with conditions. It came trimmed down to what could be proven, what could be sentenced, what could fit inside a courtroom. It punished behavior without fully naming the harm. Still, her voice changed things. Policies shifted quietly. Whispers turned into warnings. People who had never questioned power dynamics before began to listen differently, to pauses, to fear hidden beneath apologies, to the cost of telling the truth when the truth threatens the wrong person. That was her legacy. Not that she confessed, but that she documented why. The detective closed the file and shut down the screen. The red light disappeared. The room returned to normal. But the weight of it lingered, as it always would. She had spoken, and then she was gone. But the silence she left behind was louder than anything she had said, and it demanded to be answered again and again by anyone willing to look past the surface and ask what justice truly costs when truth comes last.